Every new set in any trading card game, you find cards are just incrementally more powerful than the previous set. And so over time, something eventually has to give way. The community finds an interaction or combo the developers had no intention of making to print. So much so that one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most embarrassing moments was a small child being beaten on a livestream turn 1 without playing a single card by a YCS champion. Konami, licensor of the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game staff members, regularly received abuse, headquarters got a ton of prank calls, angry emails, and staff-adjacent judges on social media called for a cease to the riots of the players online, till eventually a social media blackout was what it took for this card to finally be banned in Yu-Gi-Oh! This is the story of Yu-Gi-Oh's most hated boss monster.
Chapter 1, Prologue.
At this point in time, in 2025, we have had our fair share of bullshit over the years. Since day one of Yu-Gi-Oh!, you could open something heinous like scientist reasoning and burn your opponent's life before they've even had a turn, and this was 20 years ago. Teledad existed, which not only was a very powerful combo deck that could set up resilient big synchro boss monsters, like the notorious Stardust Dragon, it was also paywalled behind some very pricey cards and rare cards as well, truly stretching the definition of pay to win. Apocalyphort Towers was another card that has had a legacy so embedded into the Yu-Gi-Oh community that, until today, people call unaffected boss monsters towers over 10 years later. But there is one card we're going to focus on today. He is not technically a dragon, he's not fire attribute, and he certainly won't protect your network from cybersecurity threats. That card is Firewall Dragon.
Chapter 2, Master Rule 4.
Before we discuss the specifics of Firewall Dragon himself, it's important to set the scene. Master Rule 4 in 2017, almost 10 years ago, was arguably the biggest change to the history of Yu-Gi-Oh's rules. Synchros, Ixies, and Fusion monsters are all monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! You might be familiar with, and these now could no longer be summoned anywhere onto the duel field. Back in the good old days of Yu-Gi-Oh! You would activate Polymerization and dump 2 or 3 out of your hand into the grave, and you would get a twin-headed Thunder Dragon or something. Not the most economical investment in terms of card advantage, but nonetheless, you could do it within the confines of the rules. Initially, with Master Rule 4, you could only summon these monsters to the Extra Monster Zone, a new zone, or a zone a Link monster points to. A way for Konami to, I suppose, push for you to buy these new Link monsters and play Link strategies. The community thought that this would be a natural way of slowing down the game. Yu-Gi-Oh! Was at risk of bursting into overdrive with power creep, and so since you could no longer spam the field with all of these Synchros and Fusions and Xyz monsters, perhaps Yu-Gi-Oh! Would now revert back to the golden age of some real back and forth gameplay. And to some extent in hindsight, while not completely untrue, the game did sort of fall back a little bit towards a more control style meta. When you consider the fact that the best Link monsters were Honeybot, Link Spider, and Decode Talker, you could probably see why. These were, for all intents and purposes, plain vanilla monsters on the field that didn't really serve much purpose other than to create more zones. And well, Decode Talker is 2 negates, depending on who you ask.
Chapter 3, Code of the Duelist.
With the inception of Master Rule 4, the set accompanying it a mere week later was Code of the Duelist in August 2017. This was the advent of Firewall Dragon. Firewall Dragon is a 2500 attack, light attribute Cyburst monster with a link rating of 4 that requires 2+ monsters to summon. Which is just going to sound like a bunch of words to someone who hasn't played in years. Before we even focus on his effect, let's look at a couple of important aspects here. This being the summoning condition. Firewall Dragon is a link 4 monster, meaning that it requires 4 materials or monsters to summon. That's a ridiculously expensive investment for any monster in Yu-Gi-Oh! And in fact, it's one more than the God cards. Enter Link Climbing. By utilizing powerful special summoning and floating effects, you could make a Link 2, bring out a guy for free from your extra deck with the Grave effect, make a Link 3, use another extender to make a 4, and you had Firewall Dragon. You could summon Firewall with a Link 3 and a token, you could use 2 Link 2s. Pretty much any way to get to the number 4 could make you a Firewall Dragon. Firewall Dragon until today has one of the most relaxed summoning conditions of any Link 4 or boss monster. It doesn't need effect monsters, you can use tokens, it only needs 2 materials, and it creates pretty good zones with its crosshair formation, allowing you to co-link quite easily, something we'll talk about later. Firewall's quick effect is that it can return monsters from the field or graveyards, up to the number of monsters co-linked to it, and return them to the hand. And so you might be wondering, well, this is just a fancy compulsory evacuation device. Get a guy off the field, return it to the hand. Sounds like pretty standard card game removal, non-destruction style removal, right? You see, in its early days, Firewall was not returning your monsters to the hand, it was returning our monsters to the hand. So what people eventually figured out with Firewall Dragon is that if you could say, send some very important monsters from your deck to the graveyard, you could then retrieve those same monsters back to your hand. Okay, so I've returned 1 or 2 monsters in the graveyard to my hand via dumping them out of the deck into the grave through some means, right? What's the big deal here? What am I supposed to do with these guys in my hand? I probably had to normal summon to even make the Firewall in the first place. What am I doing with these guys? Firewall has a second effect. It wouldn't be modern Yu-Gi-Oh! If each card didn't have 3+ effects, a grave and a float and a negate and a rip, and punch your opponent in the mouth probably. If a monster this card points to is sent to the graveyard, even by battle, you can special summon any monster from your hand. And so you might be watching this video years later thinking to yourself, right, so you're gonna summon from your hand once, and it's going to be a Cyburst monster, right? Is it really that powerful? We see it until today, Firewall Dragon isn't doing anything even in top tier combo decks like Malice. That's because Firewall has had its text changed. This is a modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Card's errata. Firewall Dragon is the only non-classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Card to receive an errata. Now it depends how we're describing the term modern here, but the youngest card to receive an errata that isn't Firewall Dragon is Goyo Guardian, and also Ancient Fairy Dragon, which were printed in 2008 and 2009 respectively.
Firewall Dragon breaks the boundaries of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! You only get 1 normal summon a turn, and yes, you can special summon a lot, and that could lead to some broken combos, but every time you special summon, you usually need a different resource to generate that special summon. But Firewall Dragon alone gives you an infinite number of special summons, so it changes that ceiling from high to now infinity, and it opens up multiple infinite loops that are otherwise just impossible. It creates way more possibilities than any other card in the game. And that's just a fraction, because it has other effects that are very good on their own, but it's this infinite special summon effect that makes it truly over the top.
And so from here you can understand mechanically what Firewall is trying to practically do. It was easy to summon. You co-linked it, returned an important enabler or resource to the hand from your graveyard, dumping it from the deck, and then summon it onto the field by linking away a monster that the Firewall points to. In a very basic application and TLDR of what this card is doing, it's taking a monster from your deck and placing it onto the field for free. Surely this interaction would be far too convoluted, right? Summoning a Link 4 monster in the first place, summoning more monsters that then retrieve cards out of your deck, throwing them into the graveyard, recurring them back to your hand, and then summoning off other monsters on the field to then bring those monsters out into the... I mean, that just sounds like some dumb YouTube combo. It's essentially a joke from TikTok, right? Well, enter the hive mind.
Chapter 4. First Turn Kill.
Just a week later, Firewall Dragon got its first ever YCS or Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series top, making it to top 32 of YCS Toronto in September 2017, featuring cards that had previously seen almost no play whatsoever for years. Manticore of Darkness, previously used for niche deck out situations with Max C, and Grandsoil the Elemental Lord. This FTK was ridiculously consistent, and if you didn't FTK your opponent, you had a lot of True Draco and Dino relevant plays that could win the game on its own. And remember, this is 2017. This is hardly the hand trap haven that we're accustomed to in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! We don't have 20 non-engine hand traps like Imperm, Ash, Valor, Droll, all main decked with powerful heavy hitters like Mulcharmy Fualos, or Nibiru and Shifter. How this FTK worked was by going into 2 Zodiac Broad Bulls, which have been banned for a very long time now, which is also a generic rank 4 monster with 2 level 4s only, activating the effect to search a generic Beast Warrior, the Manticore of Darkness, Xyzing up into another Zoo name, back into another Broad Bull, since you can summon it with the cheating mechanic of sorts of Zodiac once per turn, and so you would get 2 generic Beast Warrior searches in one single rank 4. Firewall would then bring these Manticores out onto the field by linking some bodies away from the zone it points to, not once per turn as we've established. After getting the Manticores out, you could summon Beatrice, an honorary Burning Abyss monster, and send the Grandsoil from deck to the graveyard, which Firewall Dragon could then retrieve. This combo, or this play pattern specifically, would be a staple of Firewall Dragon for years to come. Well, year. And so after a flurry of plays later, this combo would practically end up resulting in completely decking your opponent out. You could hypothetically infinitely loop by remaking Firewall Dragon and a rank 9 monster enter Blathnir, which has the effect to banish 1 card from the top of your opponent's deck. You would perform this combo, or loop, 5 times to banish all cards out of your opponent's hand, and then a further 35 plus times to banish the rest of the cards in their deck. Used in tandem with Daigusto Emerald, a generic rank 4 which recycles monsters in your graveyard, all of those extra deck monsters, and putting them back to reuse again. Now, assuming your opponent didn't hit something which would actually interact with you, this was possible to play out for an entire afternoon. Now, at the time, nobody really thought much of this. It was some dumb YouTube combo, some clickbait title that managed to crawl its way into a YCS top. Surely this was not going to be the dominant metagame that we would ever expect from something of this kind of strategy. But one interesting thing to note here is that this wasn't the only FTK that topped YCS Toronto. There was Infernity FTK and Trickstar Handloop. Now, while not the best versions of making use of Firewall Dragon, what you're probably starting to notice is the sheer variety that Firewall was able to offer, an offer a certain type of Yu-Gi-Oh player cannot refuse.
Nah, they definitely, it was a design oversight, because what happens with cards like Firewall Dragon is, you're essentially shoehorning the design process where you can no longer print certain cards because cards like Firewall exist. So I just think it was a big oversight. At the time when links became legal, they thought that it would limit the power level of what some of the crazier decks were doing beforehand. In actuality, it was the complete opposite. They just kept printing more and more broken links, and then you had crazier end boards than what we had, not even a year prior. Think about like double to triple Beatrice, or like a single Beatrice, or like a pendulum summon, something in that respect. Like those at least had some forms of interaction. Whereas if you were playing a link deck and you had Firewall, you're only using it for evil, like maybe U-linking or something. And we saw that with Goki before we even got into FTKs. So yeah, I think it was just a big oversight in terms of Konami R&D.
Nonsense hand loops, turn skips, Firewall Dragon had the ability to facilitate anything you really could imagine. The only person seemingly catching wind of this really early and what was about to unfold over the next year was Tombox of MST TV, asking directly for Firewall to be addressed, nipping it in the bud ASAP. And in September 2017, Konami would begin to perform a pattern that would be recurring for years to come in multiple different formats for different cards. They would not be addressing the problem card of Firewall, but they would start banning all of the cards around Firewall that caused the problem. Here, Konami banned Daigusto Emerald, they banned Zodiac Broadbull, Denglong, True King Lithosagam, and of course, Grandsoil himself, the Elemental Lord. Firewall Dragon got more cards banned in its debut format, in its debut event, than Crystron Halqifibrax got banned in its entire lifespan.
Chapter 5, Circuit Break.
In 2016, 2 years prior, the set Dark Illusion had some very popular new decks: Paleozoic, Metalfoes, and it even had the notorious Fairy Tale Snow with 2 TCG, meaning Western exclusive, archetypes, Subterror, and Spyral. You see, for the longest time ever, Spyral was just one card away from being absolutely broken. A sentiment that has been echoed many times with regards to every TCG deck for the last 5 years. But this truly was the case. The Spyral deck had a lot of utility and versatile ways of playing the game. It had a lot of removal tools with Spyral Tough and Super Agent, and it also had a lot of swarm potential with Quick Fix, and very few hard once per turn restrictions, especially on their reborns. And then, it actually finally happened. The one card they were looking for. Circuit Break brought to the TCG Spyral Double Helix. At YCS Dallas in October 2017, Spyral went on to co-link its way into a 29 out of 32 top cut spot finish. At YCS London in 2017, a few weeks later, Spyral took 27 of the 32 top cut spots, with Jesse Cotton picking up the first of his many future YCS wins, with Spyral at London and Imran Khan taking YCS Dallas with, again, Spyral. This is the part of the video where I would love to give some dramatic crescendo about the dominance of an archetype, the ability to take down an entire event with a 90% top cut representation. But the reality is, like, this is not unprecedented. This is probably the 4th time it's happened in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Performapal, Teledad, Necros, literally the year before, Zodiac took 32 out of 32 top cut spots on the opening weekend. This is just kind of Yu-Gi-Oh at this point.
Chapter 6. The Ban List.
In light of all of its success, Spyral would have Spyral Quick Fix, Drones, and Gofu all limited. Now, while this may have been consistency hits, the real hit on this was machine duplication, I suppose. You could no longer duplicate Quick Fix and go +4. Spyral ends up actually shifting into a Go Second deck. Perhaps one of the few and rare times this has ever actually happened in Yu-Gi-Oh! Firewall Dragon remains an important piece of the deck, although not quite as pivotal. There was one deck at the time actually utilizing Firewall in a very niche yet degenerate way, and that deck was Trickstar's. The deck was a sort of anti-meta pick at the time, synergizing very well with Droll and Lockbird because of the metagame and also Reincarnation, looping your opponent's hand entirely of all that they have, and being made to go first is also really powerful with a control deck. If you summon a monster with 1600 attack, Trickstar had a very silly way to OTK you for multiple games worth of damage. You crash the Licorice into a monster with 1600 or more attack, killing her in the process, and then you attack directly for 800 with Lilybell. Lilybell's effect would trigger on damage, adding the Licorice from the graveyard back to the hand. You then tag the Lilybell out of the Firewall zone for Licorice, resummon the Lilybell to the Firewall zone, and repeat the process until one of you runs out of life points. And so eventually, to stop further silly but inconsistent and non-competitive combos, Firewall would be limited to one copy. No more triple Firewall loops and combos utilizing multiple summons and grave returns, with all 3 legal. So for now, Firewall wouldn't do a whole lot until World Chalice took first place at YCS Bochum 2018 in February. In a format of Pendulum Magician, this was definitely considered to be a fluke. While Pen Magician was summoning S0, a talented player who's very passionate about a very specific archetype ended up taking it all down with World Chalice. It would sadly not come into the meta as a real deck despite this historic victory. Regardless, Firewall was a massive aspect of this deck, spamming the field and flooding the board with all of the link fodder to be able to then go into more powerful monsters. It was an integral part of the strategy and demonstrates just the absolute versatility that Firewall Dragon offered to any combo style deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time.
Chapter 7. The Knightmares.
On May 3rd, 2018, Flames of Destruction was released. Every extra deck in the game ever got an immense power boost with the new Nightmare extra deck monsters. They were both removal tools and combo pieces. Nightmares were some of the first truly powerful Link monsters, ultimately ended up breaking Firewall. Not only did they have incredible effects for going second and extremely easy summoning requirements, their Link arrows were specifically designed in order to co-link, locking your opponent out of special summoning. Add to this mix of good floating bodies that could replenish the resources in hand for Firewall and float from the grave, to endlessly summon, you had a recipe for Link spam disaster. It is one of the most undervalued sentiments in the community just how impactful these Nightmares were. These Knightmares were the first generic extra deck monsters open to any deck in the game. Literally every archetype in Yu-Gi-Oh! Could play Phoenix to destroy spells and traps, Cerberus to hit a special summoned monster, and Unicorn to spin away cards without triggering grave effects. The sheer ease of access of the Knightmares, coupled with everything mentioned before, meant that these may have been the most versatile extra deck monsters ever made. No level requirement, and basically no real summoning condition other than the materials required to summon them. Tokens, non-effect monsters, you could make Knightmares with anything. And this is how they would launch our new Wrestler Overlords into the position of potential best deck. With cards like Suprex, which was both a starter to go into Isolde, as well as an extender when used as an additional normal summon with the Nightmare Goblin, Headback allowed you to extend, and all of them floated into Goki Rematch, a monster reborn for 2. It is no surprise that this deck was able to push Firewall Dragon into overdrive. This deck extra linked your opponent, it gave you a negate from Trigate Wizard, it gave the opponent Nightmare Corruptor Ibli, which made them unable to special except for links, which wasn't possible because you extra linked them. It dropped non-co-linked monsters attack from Mermaid by 1000, and it gave the board protection from battle, card effects, and targeting with all of the Nightmares respectively. On top of all that, it was incredibly consistent due to any 2 warriors being full combo. Goki was everything the average casual player would complain about. Long, drawn-out, exhaustive combos, inability to interact with all the targeting and destruction protection, hand loops with Gumblar Dragon. And it was so hard to stop this deck. They had access to staples like Midbreaker, a field spell protecting your monsters from being targeted or destroyed from hand traps. And this was the year Call by the Grave was released, an auto-win button for any combo deck going first versus hand traps. You would need at least 2 hand traps to stop Goki going second, provided that they didn't manage to still play through extend and rip the rest of the cards out of your hand with Gumblar. In June 2018 at YCS Secaucus, Goki somehow only managed to take 6 spots out of the top 32. The other decks of choice for a couple of upcoming events was actually Trickstar, Sky Striker. Some other strategies as well cropped up like ABC. Spyral was also abusing Firewall Dragon and Knightmares at the time. This was around the time a certain Triff Gaming came to prominence with his stick-to-the-game plan triple Electromite Firewall OTK multi-negate deck.
Stick to the game plan. 3 Electrons, Firewall in the middle, Exodia.
The infamous 60-card Pendulum deck was a powerhouse. And while not eventually becoming the most popular way to play Pendulum, it did sort of facilitate a lot of the kind of criminal acts of 2018. Long turn 1 combos and multiple special summonings and spamming of these crazy new Link monsters like the Electromites. Now, despite a seemingly slow start for Goki, it would win both the North American WCQ and the European WCQ, claiming similar representations for Top Cut at about a third each. And yet still, it was more impressive in Europe, as Europe was missing key components like a Link 1 monster with Link Karibo being exclusive to the NA region. Yet Europeans still adapted, and it shows just how powerful this deck was despite the handicap. Luke Parks piloted a creative tech of the Neospatian Aqua Dolphin, the inclusion of which was popularized at the North American WCQ a couple of weeks prior. This could remove hand traps from the opponent before you began to combo off, and it inflicted burn damage. An effect which would be integral to the entire game of Yu-Gi-Oh's tournament gameplay until, well, actually until this year.
With 10 seconds left until the end of the match.
And we actually get a live countdown from the crowd, who is counting down what's going to happen in the finals.
Chapter 8, the Firewall Riots.
This was around the time where people finally were getting sick and tired of FTKs, the combos, and particularly Firewall Dragon. They took it to social media and it would get progressively worse, forcing Konami to wipe out the entire comment sections of multiple posts and mediums. No one was hopeful, as players had theorized that Firewall would not be touched, as it was the ace monster of one of the Vrain's protagonists at the time running alongside the anime. As a form of promoting their new anime and products, people assumed that due to it being an important part of the anime, Konami would simply not ban Firewall. In September 2018, the ban list came, and once again, cards around Firewall would be hit instead of addressing the actual problem. The ban list would purge the format of MX Saber Invoker, Goblin, causing the Goki combo to be a bit harder to execute and more consistent, now shifting over to playing Armageddon Knight and Malicious to make a Zolde, and further iteration upon the Summon Sorceress lines. Despite this, it was still quite strong, considering at the 200th YCS, 3 YCSs taking part simultaneously across all 3 regions of the West, it would take 15 of the top 64 at Columbus, 8 out of the top 64 at Utrecht, 4 out of 64 in Mexico City. And one of the most amusing hits of this ban list would be limiting a Assault Core. This was supposed to remove the Cannon Soldier FTK aspect from the game. Cannon Soldier being a monster that can tribute a monster that it points to burn your opponent for damage. And because of all of the things mentioned previously with Firewall Dragon summoning monsters from the hand, you could essentially create infinite fodder for Cannon Soldier. And yet, ironically enough, a more powerful version of this came to the front. On October 20, 2018, in the written feature of YCS Niagara, Jeff Jones versus Hanko Chow, this would be the earliest iteration we'd see of the Danger FTK. The Dangers, released in Cybernetic Horizon, Nessie, Jackalope, Chupacabra, Bigfoot, received an additional wave support in Soul Fusion with Tsuchinoko, Dogman, and Thunderbird 2 days prior to the event. The Danger monsters were extremely powerful monsters at the time. They were bodies that allowed you to draw a card, special summon from the hand by discarding, but all of the Dangers had grave effects, most of which would net you more advantage, like summoning from the deck with Jackalope, summoning from the grave with Chupacabra, or removing your opponent's cards with Bigfoot and Thunderbird. And of course, they all triggered when discarded from, you guessed it, the Knightmares. And so this was an incredibly powerful engine for going first and second.
It was really good because it put to use the additional monsters that you would get. So instead of just, summoning Sayuja and drawing 4 cards, which turned out to just be, probably one of the better ways to use those cards, you had the option to convert them into Firewall. And then without even, getting into the FTK, you were just able to generate a bunch of bodies. And then sort of, threaten like a U-Link, or it could just be, your Firewall bouncing 3 cards instead of 1 card that you sort of see today. I think the reason that deck was so broken was just everything meshed so well. And it was sort of just like good stuff deck. You would just make Tomahawk and then make Firewall, and then you'd FTK your opponent. It's whatever.
This is what was the tipping point for Firewall Dragon. This feature match was pure despair over what was to come. It ended up losing in the finals to Goki, but it was incredibly scary because now people had discovered the Danger's ability to flood the board, spam, all while drawing through your whole deck. And so, that incident finally happened. Round 1 of YCS London 2018. This feature would become somewhat of a stain on the Yugioh community for quite some time, showing how absolutely absurd the Firewall FTK really became, and also the bizarre decision to have a multi-YCS champion world's competitor duel versus a child as a feature match. That was a decision that was made.
The YCS London 2018 feature match is a match that is going to live in infamy forever. It's where I FTK a child. But, you see, I don't just FTK children, I FTK everybody. And my philosophy is to treat each duelist the same, because I think it's an injustice to do otherwise, especially in a competitive setting like a YCS. If it were a different circumstance, different environment, then perhaps different, but I think treating people with respect of playing properly is important, and that's what I was going for.
From this point on, people would tweet Konami daily, praying for a Firewall ban. Konami's Facebook flooded with comments. YouTube forced to deactivate the comment section on every upload. There was even a community-organized template for an email or letter that was encouraged to be forwarded to Konami to ask them to remove Firewall from the game. Every single marketing post or Facebook engagement bait asking for something like, "What's your favorite Gold Sark target?" would be flooded over with 100 comments each, demanding Firewall Dragon be banned. As someone who had lived through this period in time, I cannot stress enough just how ridiculous the social media outcry was. People were left, right, and center. Anything on any Konami page ever, regardless of the platform, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, people were just spamming the comment sections, demanding Firewall be banned. And admittedly, perhaps it was a bit of a bandwagon where people just kind of joined in for the sake of it because grr Konami and stuff. I think people really took Firewall Dragon to be this culmination of all of the problems of Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time, and so vented their frustration at how powerful the game was and how powerful Yu-Gi-Oh! Had become during 2018 throughout this time period, most of which perhaps could be attributed to Firewall, but also a lot of the different things surrounding it, like Penned Magician FTK earlier in the year, something that may be a subject for a future video. Somebody had even suggested to sue Konami over the false advertising of the ban list. The backlash got so bad that Josh Bavarnik asked people on Zodiac Duelist, a very prominent Facebook group at the time for Yu-Gi-Oh, to stop harassing Konami. Josh being a fairly prominent member of the judge program, although not actually an employee or official representative. I have to legally clarify this. And so it would get even worse when Konami posted a Legacy of the Duelist trailer with Firewall Dragon as the main feature, as well as a poll about which card is a better floodgate on Facebook. The community perceived this almost as a mockery by Konami by just how out of touch this communication was. Back at YCS London, the deck was incredibly dominant. It had such a low representation that in the early rounds, it was classified as rogue and other. But by round 9, there were still 20 players running this deck, and it was so powerful, Team Samurai X1 ended up topping with it as well.
What I really look back on in terms of decks with high power level output, like Goki, like the Danger FTK, I guess you can even argue, maybe not the Ronga Mini deck, didn't really use Firewall, but what really came from those decks was high ceiling and not really technical play, but they were the first part of like freestyle combo. Alternatively, like Goki had like actual combo lines, right? And we didn't really have decks like that beforehand. They were more like freestyle, but they weren't, you know, crazy power level output. You sort of only needed to know like 1 or 2 steps. And I think that's where the underrepresentation came from. You also had a lot of people who would view decks like Goki or the Danger FTK as inconsistent, and they would opt for a deck like Sky Striker or maybe Pure Thunder Dragon. I'm just trying to think if there were any, I guess like Altergeist was like another deck in that sort of format. So yeah, they would default to stuff like that because they thought they were more consistent, power level wasn't as good, but you got to play more games and you weren't bricking. And I think it was only during COVID, maybe like post-COVID, where people sort of played the more unfair, higher power level output decks, and like Konami design sort of like met them at parity, where they would just continue to you know, print these really ridiculous decks that would have high ceilings and just require you to memorize, like, I have to do this, into this. And I think Goki and, you know, the Danger FTK sort of just ended up being the original, like, those decks.
This is one of those representation versus conversion discussions. Not a lot of people were actually playing Firewall FTK for these events, and yet it was converting numbers like never before seen in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. A real handful of players entering a tournament, and yet almost all of them made deep runs into at least day 2, many of them topping the event. Admittedly, some of the best players in the world at the time were running this archetype and this deck and this strategy, so naturally it's going to gravitate towards more success there, but it must be emphasized how ridiculous it is for such a high conversion rate, despite such a low population turnout for a deck. It's one of those things that perhaps people didn't really hop on to the hype with because it only got 2nd place, and naturally, fallacy of the Babe Ruth effect, people naturally want to play the best deck, the first place deck. Danger FTK was incredibly powerful due to cards like Azathoth, a generic enough monster to access with 2 level 4s, turning off all monster effects your opponent can use this turn. That means no hand traps and no more responses when going 2nd. The only way to consistently stop this deck was to very specifically draw Infinite Impermanence, a trap card usable from the hand, and negate Firewall Dragon since you couldn't use monster effects, holding it for when they had summoned it. And yet this deck still had ways to play through that. Nightmare Unicorn could shuffle away your own Firewall or Cannon Soldier and then re-summon it to continue with the combo. Admittedly, that would require an insane hand, but this was an insane deck.
The Danger Dark World FTK deck was one of the strongest decks I've ever played in Yu-Gi-Oh! What it allowed you to do was FTK the opponent with incredible ease. But the truth is, in that deck, Firewall Dragon was not the only offender, as once Firewall Dragon was banned, FTKs were still viable without it. They were just harder. The thing is, the deck can be broken up into several pieces. The Firewall FTK of choice in this deck, and it could have been any sort of them, was to use Cannon Soldier alongside Grapha and Firewall. This combination meant that you could loop your Cannon Soldier infinite number of times and kill your opponent. The Danger deck was very good at drawing, but it also discards, so it works well with Dark Worlds, which interbridged with the FTK. The thing is, the Danger deck could deep draw into essentially any combo, so you could play any cool 2-3 card combination, try and dig for it, and beat your opponent that way. But when they synergize together, that just makes it all neatly come up into a tier 1 or tier 0 strategy.
After YCS London, the deck did begin to fade away, be it due to players maining cards now like Droll and Lockbird, stopping you from using Dangers and switching to other decks altogether. It was still quite strong at the regional scene and of course, obnoxious to play against. Leading up to the next ban list, every social media site saw prayers to Konami for the removal of Firewall Dragon, and so, on November 30th, We got the ban list.
Nothing was limited. So we just woke up. Firewall's banned, baby. So am I, but like whatever. At least Firewall's banned, baby.
Here it is.
Firewall Dragon is banned. That'll probably be the title of this video because who cares about anything else?
I'm not seeing any bans here. Gumblar isn't banned. Never mind. Gumblar's not banned. This is so sad, Alexa. I'm still mad about that. They did it! Yugioh was finally saved, if we ignore Slash Draw FTK and Wrong Gominiad, but that is a topic for another day. Firewall was finally thrown into the pit of banlist despair and forgotten, and after the errata in December 2020, 6 years later, it would never again see any play like it once did before.
It's been almost a decade since the release of Firewall Dragon. Yet, if that card was released with its full and old effects today, it would still have a profound impact on Yu-Gi-Oh! That card was truly a menace, and it enabled so many things that really should not be capable in a card game. And even at the points where it did exist and the format was fine, it's only because the other supporting cast of cards didn't make Firewall Dragon playable. So the legacy it leaves behind is one of pain for me, where it feels like it ruined what otherwise could have been good formats, and it dominated many metagames. And it did so in ways that were really not fair, and I'm happy to see it gone. Of course, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! May have its problems, and we have very often bad formats, but at least Firewall isn't contributing to make them any worse.
Today, you'll see Firewall Dragon being used exclusively for its intended purposes, an extender of a Cyburst monster, once per turn, and no longer relying on filling the grave with key floodgates or FTK enablers to recycle to the hand. Instead, Firewall is being used to actually disrupt your opponent and not FTK them. During this time period, people kind of saw Firewall Dragon as this emblem, this symbol for everything that had gotten wrong with Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout 2018. Strange new summoning mechanics that they had not grown up with before. Long, drawn-out turn 1 combos, FTKs, sitting there watching your opponent draw their entire deck. The embarrassingly poor communication from Konami, failure to address feedback, and of course, the wildly overtuned card design of this year. I mean, we had seen Electromite, Penned Magician FTK with S0, Firewall. 2018 was a bit of a disaster for how powerful cards had become. And yet, perhaps this could be seen as a case of a loud minority. 2018 across the board was a record-breaking year for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! By all metrics, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was completely flourishing. It was booming like no other year previously. Highest attendance record for the European Championship, the North American Championship, most players attending an EU YCS, an NA YCS, a Latin American YCS. Every metric was being broken in 2018, and yet, if it was that bad, why were people still playing in their droves? So in hindsight, what can we really say about Firewall Dragon in 2018? Was it really that bad? Let me know in the comment section down below. Thank you so much everyone for watching. A lot of effort went into this one, so please consider leaving a like, a comment, and engaging with the video and channel by subscribing. If you want to see more of this long form content, then of course, make sure to subscribe. Consider becoming a Patreon or YouTube channel member with all of the perks associated with it to support my work and alleviate some of the costs with producing this type of content. Have a great festive season, Christmas, New Year, and we'll see you next time, hopefully, in a similar type of video. The story of the Dragon Rulers.